There's a lot more to power chords than just Green Day and Nirvana songs. In fact, if you start applying some of the music theory you know to the power chord concept, you'll find that writing with power chords is actually a very rich and fertile ground to be writing in. There's a lot of options, a lot of cool things we can do that we can't do when we're working with full chords. So in this video, really what I want to do is tackle the music theory of power chords. What are they? What are the variations that we see? How can we use them? And how can we write with them? So let's get started here. All you have to do is pick a root. I'm going to pick the note G. And if you go up 5 notes of your major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that gives us a 5th. That's the note D. So a root and a 5th. That is what a power chord is. If you play a root and a 5th at the same time, you have a power chord. Now to me, that's kind of underwhelming. When I first heard the word power chord, I expected something like, epic and massive and glorious. And then I got this. And that really didn't sound too power infused for the word power chord. But really all you got to do is just throw some distortion on that. If you play a distorted power chord, something magical happens. You get that sound right there, which is glorious. And really the foundation of rock and roll is if we double that, let's have another guitar play a G power chord, and let's have a bass play a low G note at the same time as a kick drum hitting on a drum set with a crash cymbal. And you'll get this awesome, which is the greatest thing ever. That's the foundation of like every rock and roll song right there. Just this giant wall of noise. And that's what comes out of just playing a G power chord. Now here's the thing, a G power chord is not a chord. That name is deceptive. Chords need 3 notes. And we're only playing 2 notes. We're playing G and D. If we look at a G major chord, well that has a G and a D in it, but it also has a B in it. And we're not playing a B. If we look at a G minor chord, a G minor also has a G and a D in it, but it has a B flat as well. So when you see G and D, you're playing 2/3 of a major chord or 2/3 of a minor chord, but we don't know which one it is. So this could substitute as a G major, this could substitute as a G minor. Really, if another instrument is playing one of those other notes, one of those thirds, the B or the B flat, then this will transform into sounding like one of those chords. So listen, here's a G power chord, but I'm gonna have another guitar play the note B. And you'll hear that sounds like a major chord now. Same thing again, play the G power chord, but have another guitar play the note B flat. And you'll hear this is functioning as a minor chord. So it's really important to remember that power chords are not major chords or minor chords, but they could be either, depending on how you treat them. They're very transformative like that. So this is the first way I would recommend you use power chords. Use them as substitutes for major chords or minor chords. Nothing else, not diminished, not augmented, just major or minor. You can sub in a power chord instead. So take a chord progression you already know, turn it into power chords, and now you've got like a punk rock version of that song or like a metal version of that song. For example, Hotel California, classic chord progression, all major chords and minor chords, nothing too fancy in there. So we should be able to take those same chords and transform them into power chords and get a heftier, grittier version of those exact same chords, right? And if you wanted to make like a Metallica version of this, all you gotta do is just play some palm mutes on it and do your best James Hetfield impersonation.
On a dark desert highway, a cool wind in my hair, yeah. Warm smell of colita, rising up through the air.
So in addition to just using power chords as chord substitutes, I like to think of power chords as just big fat notes, just giant notes. So don't stop thinking about keys and chords, just think about if you've got a sequence of notes you like. So let's just do okay, so I'm basically doing like Inspector Gadget, all right? I like that sequence of notes, which I just stole from Inspector Gadget. But if I wanted to turn it into power chords, let's just literally take every note and add the 5th to it. And you can hear that's very indicative of the stuff that you hear in, Megadeth, Iron Maiden, Metallica. We hear this kind of stuff all the time. We have a cool line of notes, and then it just becomes a series of power chords instead. Think of the song Iron Man. The main riff there is just these slid power chords, but this is the melody of the song. Later on, we hear it just as single notes. So it's like a smaller version of the power chord version. So pretty simple stuff. Just take a simple sequence that you already like and just turn every note into its own power chord by adding a 5th on top of it. The next thing you'll see a lot with power chords is to invert them. We know a power chord is just a root and a 5th. But if you play the 5th on the bass instead, then you get a really cool sound. You get this nice inverted power chord effect. So let's take a look at our G power chord. We were playing this before. It's a G and a D, right? But what if I play the D right here? I'll keep the D there, but I'll play the G above it instead, and I get this. And this is the kind of thing we hear a a lot in, like, I think of ZZ Top music. Think of Smoke on the Water. Smoke on the Water is all inverted power chords. If you look at this first sequence, it's just a 0 and a 0, right? It's a D and a G, and that's just a G power chord. So a G power chord, and to this is a B flat power chord that's just been inverted. So here's the original power chord version of Smoke on the Water. If I invert every one of those power chords, I get that grungy ZZ Top cool flavor to it. I hope you hear the difference there. There's a lot more grit in an inverted power chord than there is in a first position power chord. Also, a cool thing about inverted power chords is that you can access like lower tones that are even legal on your guitar. For example, like my guitar is in standard tuning right now. So if I wanted to play something like a C power chord, I can't do that. There's no low C. The lowest C I can find is here. But if I play an inverted C power chord, I could just do this. Which actually, with the help of your bass player can thump away at a really low C, you can do this. And it's a good substitute for a really low, genty C power chord, even though you don't have access to a low C. So by understanding that you can just, use these low strings in a different function that you normally do, you can actually like write in riffs lower than you're supposed to in standard, and it'll still feel like a power chord as long as you know your bass player can assist you by filling in that low bass note. Now, before I go any further, I just want to present two little shapes here for you. We're going to call this a diminished power chord, and we're going to call this a stretched out power chord. I'm going to explain what those mean here in just a minute, but I want to introduce that, first off, those aren't official names, that's just what I'm going to call them, but they're going to kind of come in handy for the next section here. So a very similar concept to what we were just doing with these big notes is to take the scales you've already learned and just take every note and turn it into its own power chord so you can write in that scale just using power chords. So like, I really like Phrygian dominant, right? And if I just take every one of those notes and turn it into a power chord, I have a really nice sequence of notes to compose with. And I'm really not even thinking about chords. I'm not thinking major, minor. I'm just thinking, is this note in the scale? Yes. Okay, let's turn it into a power chord. And you can get some cool results out of that. Now here's where the theory helps out. Let's say we're composing in A minor. I can take any note in my A minor scale and I can build a power chord off of it. And the fifth that I end up playing will always be in the scale. Look, when I play an A power chord, my fifth is an E, and E is in the key of A minor. When I play a D power chord, my fifth is A, and obviously A is in the key of A minor. So this applies everywhere except the second note. If I try playing a power chord off the second degree, which is B, then my ring finger, the fifth, ends up playing an F sharp. And F sharp is not in the A minor scale. So this entire video I've just been saying ignore it. Just play power chords wherever you want. They're big notes. And that's true. But you do want to keep in mind that in A minor, we have a B diminished chord. And that's where this little diminished power chord is going to help us out. There's no such thing as a diminished power chord, but that's what I call it. Any guitar player will know what you're talking about. It's just a tritone. You've got a root and a tritone. And that's going to imply a diminished 2 chord, which is totally different than just playing a power chord on my second degree. And actually, I think there's a lot of really cool options here because I love diminished chords, especially coming from that 2 position back to the 1. So hopefully you hear that this is a lot more flavorful. There's a lot more mystery behind this than there is just playing, right? That's big, that's huge, that's rock and metal. This might be a little more neoclassical, a little more dramatic, a little bit more melody going on by using this diminished 2. This also applies in major, right? If I was in A major, the 7th note is supposed to get a diminished chord. And if I try playing a power chord from my 7th note in major, then all of a sudden my ring finger is playing a D sharp. And that's not allowed in the key of A major. There is no D sharp in the key of A major. So if I play a diminished power chord instead, starting on that 7th note, it can help resolve me to my tonic. Now, in my experience, this is kind of rare to see. I don't see a lot of 7-1 progressions. What I do see a lot in punk rock is the stretched out power chord. So here's my A power chord, right? What if I just took my first finger and stretched it out to hit that A flat or that G sharp? Do you hear what I get? I get this really nice little movement of my leading tone coming back up to my tonic. And you'll see this a lot in metal, you'll see this a lot in punk, and I need you to know that when you see a stretched out power chord like this, the important thing to remember is to look at the note, look at the highest note. Right now my pinky's playing it. That note is actually the root of this chord. This is actually a major chord substitute anytime you see something like this. My pinky's playing an E, my first finger's playing a G sharp, those are 2 notes of an E major chord. And that's usually what this shape is doing when you see it. When you see a stretched out power chord, look at the pinky note and ask yourself, what note is that? And chances are you're probably playing that major chord. So here was an A power chord, right? And then if I stretch it out, this is not an A power chord anymore. This is most likely an E major chord. And it could help me go down to F sharp and then to a real E power chord. So I could do something like A, E over G sharp, F sharp to E. Pretty cool stuff. Now let's go back to the minor scale here for a little bit, because if you know about minor keys, you know that that 5th chord is naturally supposed to be a minor chord, but we often make it a major chord because it's the dominant chord and it helps pull us back to the tonic. So we could imply this major 5 chord, we can imply this dominant chord by doing our stretched out power chord, even in minor keys. So here's an A minor, or here's an A power chord. We're thinking of it as implying A minor, and then we can think of this as an E major, being the dominant chord in the key of A minor. This is the same thing I just did, right? And now I'm calling it minor. But remember, we don't have context. There's nothing else playing those extra notes in the background. So we can make this, we could make this sound like major just by adding in the right notes in the background, adding in C sharps, G sharps, other notes of A major. And this would suddenly sound like an A major progression. Take a listen. Now here's that same chord progression, but this time in the background, I'm just going to fill in notes of like C natural, G natural, notes from A minor, and take a listen to how drastically different that same chord progression sounds. Now, let's go back to that Hotel California progression, because we can kind of put all these ideas together here now. I said the first chord in Hotel California is a B minor. We can imply that just by playing a B power chord. The second chord is F sharp major. I can imply that by doing a stretched out power chord, like so. The next chord is A major. I can imply that with an A power chord. The next chord is an E major. I can imply that with another stretched out power chord. And so on. Here's a G major. Here's a D major that's implied, and then an E power chord and an F sharp power chord. So you can actually see now some of the cool chromaticism that's imbued into this chord progression. Look. And you can hear it a lot easier too now that we've set it up this way. So I think when you start learning all these different options on how to play power chords, you provide some really cool ways to play simple chord progressions like that. That's a big jumpy chord progression, but now it's the slidey descending riff. Kind of sounds like a 38 special song, some 80s riff. But it's really cool to hear that same chord progression without all of the thirds and fifths present all the time, what it turns into. And the last thing I want to note here is that this stretched out power chord does have other contexts. If you look at these 2 notes I'm playing an A flat and an E, G sharp and an E. These could be 2 notes of a G sharp augmented chord, right? So it's not like this has to be an E major, and I just want you to be aware of this. These could also be kind of implying a minor flat 6 chord. But in my experience, anytime you see this, most of the times you see this, just take a look at that highest note and think to yourself major chord. Hey, my pinky's playing an E, so this is really an E major. And 9 times out of 10, that's the function that that little shape is being seen in. So I personally think power chords are really cool things because there's so many options. When you see a power chord pop up, it's not major, it's not minor, it could be either or. You can play with that as a composer, and you can really mess with people's expectations and come up with really cool, interesting effects because of the ambiguity of a power chord. And they also sound awesome. So if you're into rock and metal and just big epic sounding stuff, you're really going to want to know power chords and all their variations. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something. If you did like this video, you can thank my Patreon supporters for making it possible. Thanks, and see you next time.